Can everybody hear me all right? Barry's got some books for the quarterly. If you don't have one, if you'll raise your hand, he'll get one of those to you. And if you do have your quarterly, turn to page 54. Lesson 5 is the lesson we're going to be covering this week, continuing the study of Joshua. Joshua was a great servant of the Lord, a leader of the Israelite people, and a good name on top of that, I think. If we have any visitors, my name's Josh. That's the reason I say that. And then we'll go ahead and get a daily Bible reader count. Michael, get those. If you'll raise your hand for daily Bible readers. And let's see. John, if you don't mind, would you lead us in a word of prayer before we begin our lesson?
Dear Father in heaven, we thank you so much for this day, and we thank you for the chance to come and to study from your word. We thank you for all the blessings you give us every day of our lives. Please be with us as we study this morning. Help us to pay close attention. Help us to learn things that will help us in our daily lives. Please be with us as we go through the week. Help us to be the Christian people we need to be every day. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Johnny. And if you do have your quarterlies open, hang there for just a second. As you can tell, we've got quite a few verses. We're not going to read all that in its entirety this morning, but I am going to go back just a little bit to a few of the events that will, I think, tie into Joshua leading the Israelites into the city of Jericho for this great battle. And I was kind of graced. The luck of it fell. This particular lesson that I get, because I think everybody knows the story of Joshua leading the Israelites marching around the city of Jericho. If you were to go downstairs and ask even some of the small children, I think that's even common knowledge enough that a lot of them will know. That's one of the things that Joshua is probably most known for when we have discussions or Bible lessons or Bible study, including him. And to be fair, Joshua did a great thing. He was a great leader, and he did lead the people well. But most of the credit does need to go to God, because God was actually who delivered his chosen people through this. But we do want to give credit to Joshua too, because he was in fact a great leader during this time. And so bookmark that for just a second. I'm not going to go and reiterate everything that we've done up to this point, but I'm going to go back on a few pertinent pieces of details through the first 5 chapters in the book of Joshua that kind of leads us up to where we are here in lesson 5, but it's chapter 6. First of all, we know that Joshua takes Moses' place in leading the Israelites' people after Moses' death. He was sanctioned with that choice by God. He was chosen by God to lead the Israelites to Canaan, or the Promised Land. We read in chapter 1, verse 2. And the thing that I like to point out about Joshua is from everything that we have in the Scriptures, he seems up to the task for taking that responsibility. There's no mention of him having doubts about himself or even asking, why me? And I don't say this necessarily. There's a lot of things that we'll point out, a few things that kind of, some traits that kind of compare. I mean, Moses and Joshua go through some pretty parallel things at certain times, and we'll get to that a little bit later. But Moses was somewhat more of a little bit of a reluctant leader. If you'll remember in the book of Exodus in chapter 3 and chapter 4, from Moses' personality might be more like me, not that he was not a good leader, because Moses was a great leader. But when I say a reluctant leader, maybe he just kind of looked upon himself like, are you sure, Lord? Are you sure you want me to lead these people? Exodus 3, verse 11, he said something along the lines of, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh to lead the people out of Egypt? And in Exodus chapter 4, verse 13, paraphrasing, please send someone else in my stead. Moses obviously followed through, but it just seemed that he might have been a little bit reluctant in the beginning when God came and spoke directly to him. We don't really see that with Joshua. Joshua doesn't really have much other than, from everything that we can read, carrying through with everything that God asked him to. So that's definitely a great trait that we want to keep in mind in studying the book of Joshua. And on the other side of that, the Israelites appeared to accept Joshua as their new leader. as we read in chapter 1, if you go back, God gives Joshua the position of replacing Moses after Moses had died. And of course, we remember that Moses was not allowed to visit the promised land. So Joshua's task is carrying the people and the younger generation of men that were under that certain age. If you remember going back to when the spies were sent to camp out and do some reconnaissance work, I guess, for the land of Canaan, and how 10 of the men noted that the land was very good, but they were also very afraid of the people that were there and the size of these men. And Joshua and Caleb, if you'll remember, were the only two that basically felt like, God's given us this land, we can do this. But going back to my point, as Joshua becomes the new leader of the Israelites, they accept him willingly. If you'll remember in chapter 1, verses 16 through 17, so they answered Joshua, saying, all that you command us, we will do. And wherever you send us, we will go. Just as we heeded Moses in all things, so will we heed you. And if you've got the task that Joshua has, the second part of where Joshua picks up to where Moses left off is crossing the Jordan River and the cities, and of course Jericho being the first battle that we're going to talk about. These are some great things that it's one thing to be a great leader, but you do need to have the goodwill of your people to be good followers as well, to carry out the word that God's given them. And so that's a pretty strong I don't know what else that the people could say to give Joshua a little bit more confidence that he could be a good leader, in that whatever you say, we'll do. Wherever you send, we'll go. And just as we heeded Moses, we will heed you. So probably the perfect scenario to have a situation where you're going to be led into this new land that God has promised. God has promised, going back to Abraham and all of his descendants, God has promised Joshua and the Israelites the land of Canaan. And if you'll remember, there were, we talk about the 12 tribes, and we don't really get into that, and I won't spend too much time on that, but it is kind of important to mention something real quick about the 12 tribes. The 12 tribes kind of go back in relation to the sons of Jacob. And if you'll remember, Jacob did have 12 sons, so therefore 12 tribes. But it's not necessarily that easy. It's not too difficult, but the sons of Jacob, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. Those were the 12 sons of Jacob. However, if you'll remember, the tribe of Levi, they are not necessarily promised land like the other tribes are, in that, not that they weren't special enough to have their own land, but they had special positions as priests. They were to keep the Ark of the Covenant, which we'll get into a little bit here in chapter 6, and we talked about, or we'll also, as Derek mentioned last week, that they were responsible for carrying the Ark across the Jordan River. They had special tasks, and they were promised other things, but they weren't promised a portion of land like the other tribes were. So if you take away the tribe of Levi, then you have 11 tribes. But there's also, if you kind of notice, if you've ever looked at a map of the 12 tribes of Judah and their respected lands that they settled in, there's not a tribe of Joseph. And again, it's not because Joseph wasn't special. We know that Joseph had a very big part as being one of the children of Jacob, and his part that he played in being sold into slavery and coming along as he did. But actually, Joseph's two sons were kind of given their respective tribes. So if you take away 12, minus Levi and minus Joseph, then you have 10 tribes, and then Joseph's two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, gives you the 12 tribes of Israel. And the beginning of all this starts as they cross into the river of Jordan into the land of Canaan. But I bring this up because it's important to mention in chapter 1, and I may be redoing this. I think Johnny had this lesson. The Reubenites, the Gadites, and half the tribe of Manasseh. I don't understand why half the tribe, but if you'll look on a map of the 12 tribes and the lands that they settled, you do see one side of Manasseh, and you'll see another side split by the Jordan River. But they were kind of content where they were on the east side of the Jordan River, because apparently they had livestock, and they were farmers that kept their animals, and it was good flat, rich land to keep their livestock on. They were content where they were. However, Joseph made the point to tell them in the first chapter that even though you're good where you're at, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, the other tribes, the land is promised to us in the land of Canaan, and the men, your families and your children and the women can stay here on the east side of the Jordan if they choose, but we need all of us to fight, because we're going to have to fight. This is our land that God has promised us, but we do have to fight for it. God will deliver this to us, but we do have to fight. And if we all can work and we all can fight and take on these battles and take these cities, then the land of rest that you have on the east side of the Jordan will be given to you then. When all your other brethren can settle here in the land of Canaan, then you can go back. So it's important to kind of point that out, because the Israelites as one, all the men of fighting and warrior age, I guess you could say, were given this same task. And it's a respectable thing that if you could imagine being in that same spot, if you were in the tribe of Reuben, for example, and you're a farmer and your livestock can fare perfect right here where you're at, it's kind of hard to cross over the Jordan River with everybody else and fight when you know you're good right here. But it is, they did see the importance of all fighting together to get what God had promised them. Moving on to chapter 2. Jeremy did a good lesson with Rahab and the spies. Of course, we know the importance of that Rahab played and hiding the spies, and the importance that the spies played in journeying out to scope out the land of Jericho, because this is chapter 6. That's what we're focusing on today, the taking of the city of Jericho. And Joshua, being the good leader and warrior that he was, he knew the importance of that being the first city. And also, we're going to learn today in chapter 6 of how well that the city of Jericho was surrounded and blocked up to where it was not necessarily easy to get in. It was good that he sent his spies out. But what I want to point out about chapter 2 is that Rahab, and apparently all the leaders and the people of Canaan, had heard of the Israelites' former conquests. In chapter 2, verses 9 through 10, let me pull that scripture up real quick because I think it's important to point out. Chapter 2, verses 9 through 10. I know that the Lord, and this is Rahab speaking to the two spies, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. She goes on in verse 11 to say, and as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted. And in chapter 2, the rulers of the city of Jericho were very aware that there were spies in the land, and they came to Rahab to kind of ask her if she was hiding these people out, or if she had seen them. I should say that to ask Rahab if she had seen these men. So the people of Canaan, the people in the city of Jericho, they were all well aware of what the Israelites were capable of, and they were aware of the Israelites' God, the Lord, and what he had helped them do. So it's important to point out how fearful all the people are at this time, because the people of Canaan kind of pretty well know that there's a good chance that the Israelites that are able to cross the Jordan River are coming for them in their cities. Let's see. Chapter 3, we know the story, and I think Derek had kind of captured chapter 3 and chapter 4 last week. But the Israelites crossing the Jordan River, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that one, but just in your mind, think about, I think Derek did a good job of pointing this out. If in your mind you could visualize how Joshua was able to, through God, stop the flowing of the Jordan River basically and just back that water up, and how he promised that the Levite priests, when they stepped down, that the ground that they stood on would become dry and let them cross. It started with that, and then the countless thousands of descendants of Abraham were crossing this Jordan River. It's bound to have been a sight and no small task, all the people that were crossing that river. And then in chapter 4, God instructed them to have a memorial, and they took the stones that represented each of the 12 tribes and they placed them in the Jordan River. Those were all things to memorialize how big of an event that this was, that they actually crossed over into the promised land. And remember also, too, that God, Moses was not to enter into the promised land, nor were the older generation above, and I just don't want to get that particular age wrong, but I was thinking it was 20, other than Joshua and Caleb. So this is a younger generation of men that we're dealing with here that are actually crossing over, and that will be the warriors in the later chapters. Real quick, chapter 5, it's not mentioned in our lesson books, but there were some a few significant things I think that's worth pointing out before we get into chapter 6. But in chapter 5, once the people have safely crossed into the land of Canaan, they settled and camped in an area that they called Gilgal. And one of the first things that they did is God instructed Joshua to circumcise the men. And it's kind of important to point out the reason why. While the Israelites were in the wilderness for 40 years, the younger generation had not had that circumcision that was commanded by God. And so that is something that he asked them to do. And it's also important to point out that they had observed the Passover once they got there. Now, the Passover was dating back to Moses and the Egyptian bondage and how the blood over the posts in the household so that they would be spared, the children would be spared. That was something that a year later after that, God instructed the people of Israel to observe the Passover and have that Passover feast. I don't think that it was mentioned anywhere in Scripture that there was another time in that remainder of time that they were in the wilderness that they observed the Passover, but they did here. God instructed them to observe and celebrate the Passover while they were camped in the area of Gilgal. And another important thing I think that's pretty neat is that it mentioned that they fed on the produce of the land. And that meaning that they ate of the food that was of the land, they no longer required the manna. So that was kind of officially, I think, the end of God having to provide the manna that he fed them with out in the wilderness for so many years. But the end of chapter 5, and I'm going to turn that, if you want to turn with me to that one, I'm just going to focus on the last few verses of chapter 5, because this is directly after the feast of the Passover. But chapter 5, verse 13, and it came to pass when Joshua was by Jericho that he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, a man stood opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, Are you for us or for our adversaries? So he said, No, but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped and said to him, What does my Lord say to his servant? Then the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, Take your sandal off your foot, for the place where you stand is holy. And Joshua did so. So if you're in Joshua's place and you're camped out and you know that the battle of Jericho is at hand, hopefully that's a good symbol that the commander of the army of the Lord comes to you. Joshua asks, I guess, a pretty pertinent question. Are you for us or are you for our adversaries? The first few times that I had read this, just the fact that he said no, maybe that confused me just a little bit. He just says no. He didn't say, I'm for you, the Lord's people, but I think Joshua was safe to assume that. But he did instruct him to loose his sandal, for where you stand is on holy ground. And that sounds very, very familiar. Where have we heard that or had that vision in our heads before? Moses. When he was instructed in speaking to the burning bush, he was notified that where he stood was holy ground and to loose his sandals. So a lot of parallels that we can draw between Joshua and Moses. As Moses was able through God to part the Red Sea, Joshua was able to stop the flow of the river of Jordan to let his people cross. They were kind of approached by someone directly through God and spoken to directly. So a lot of parallels between Moses and Joshua in these. So now we come to chapter 6. And now if you want to turn back to page, or have page 54 open, in your quarterlies, we're going to kind of talk about the destruction of the city of Jericho. Verse 1, if you read verse 1 alone in chapter 6, it pretty well kind of gives you a very good description of the city of Jericho. And not only, I mean, it's not that the rulers of Jericho built these walls for the Israelites, but I think that they probably did their best to kind of keep things as tight as they could because they knew they were coming. Chapter 6, verse 1 says, Now Jericho was securely shut up because the children of Israel. None went out and none came in. That sounds pretty airtight. I do believe also that they were aware that the two spies were there previously. Rahab had led the people out, and obviously we're going to focus upon Rahab today. But Rahab had told the people of the leaders of the city of Jericho that, you may check this way or up towards the mountains, and kind of led them off the trail. She hid them until the following morning. But the rulers of Jericho were obviously aware that there were spies. It's amazing how maybe they might know that, but obviously they're afraid of them. The fact that it says that Jericho was securely shut up because of the children of Israel says quite a lot. And going back to the fact that God is promising the land of Canaan, verse 2 says, "And the Lord said to Joshua, See, I have given Jericho into your hand, its king and the mighty men of valor." So at this point, Joshua is about to receive his instruction on how to take the city of Jericho. If you are a leader of 12 tribes of men of fighting age, but you're up against a pretty significant task. You're men on foot against a city that is completely surrounded by walls. And I think if I go back and look, I think there's actually like maybe 2 sets of walls, and there was area on the top of that. It was a fortress, I guess you could think of it. The city that lay behind the walls was very securely separated by those walls. I'm going to read, if you'll read with me, I'm going to go through verses 3 through 5 right here out of the quarterly. This is God speaking to Joshua. "You shall march around the city, all you men of war. You shall go all around the city once. This you shall do 6 days. And 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. But the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. It shall come to pass, when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, that all the people shall shout with a great shout. Then the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people shall go up, every man straight before him." Now, I'm not, I have interest in the Civil War, certain things about World War II. A lot of us may have a fascination with those sort of things, but I in no way know anything about battle strategy or something that is a general leading his men into battle. I know nothing about how you go through that. What's the best way, separating the men or whatever the case would be. But you kind of have to agree that if you're taking a bunch of men with you and you're up against a fortress, that going and marching around the city a certain number of times doesn't necessarily seem like something that we might think is a very effective way of breaking into the city of Jericho. But this is instruction given to them by God, so I'm giving the Israelites credit here. I think we could take note that this younger generation of men that are serving as the warriors for the people of Israel, apparently they've learned a lot from the time that the Israelites were first in this leaving out of Egypt into the wilderness. Because if you might remember in the books of Exodus and the book of Numbers, there was a lot of questioning going on by the Israelite people. It was said a couple of different times, "Have you led us?" Directly to Moses. They weren't saying these things to God, but they were saying to Moses, "Have you led us out here to die, to starve in the wilderness? We would have been better off if we were in Egypt. At least we had food there. We kind of knew each day, we were in bondage and we were slaves, but we knew we could eat. We knew we had a place to live and a place to go." The one thing that I will continue to give credit for is that even this was not necessarily probably the most effective from a battle sense that you would think of way to approach destructing the city. The Israelites did not question it. And this kind of leads to, if you go to Hebrews chapter 11, this is made mention of in Hebrews chapter 11, the Faith Hall of Fame chapter as we know it, that this particular battle and the mention of the Israelites marching around the city of Jericho, this was a great test of their faith. This showed and this proved that they believed God when he said, "I will deliver you." The older generation of Israelites, while they were in there, the 10 of the 12 tribes that went out to spy the land of Israel, if you'll remember, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, 10 of those men agreed that the land was great, would be perfect for them, and they knew that God had promised them that land. But they were afraid of the men there. They said that they described them as giants and that there was just no way that they could defeat them. This was why that group of people were not they were not able to enter into the promised land. They basically had doubted God. And the men here, the men that are going to go up into battle, they're not, well, we hadn't got, I guess I'm ahead of myself a little bit, because Joshua is basically going to go to the men that are going to fight this battle, and he tells them all these things that God has given him, the instructions. And they don't have any questions. They don't say, "We can't do this," that this is a suicide mission. They don't say any of that. They apparently, as the scripture tells us, they just accept their battle and they're going to go to it. So the next few verses, that's what Joshua is doing. He calls the priests and says to them, now it is important that the Ark of the Covenant is included in this. Just as it was in crossing the Jordan River, the Levite priests were to carry the Ark. And if you'll remember the Ark is what, it was explained to Moses exactly how it was to be built, that it was covered with gold leaf and the contents of the Ten Commandments, and I think the rod of Aaron and all these things. And it was something that was to be treated as holy, and that's why the Levites had the responsibility of carrying this and kind of keeping watch over it. But God also says that the ark is to kind of be led through around the city as they marched around the city of Jericho. So Joshua is kind of given his instructions that were given to him by God. He's given it to these people. Take up the Ark of the Covenant and let 7 priests bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns. Very specific. Proceed and march around the city. Let him who is armed advance before the Ark of the Lord. Now, as you're reading through chapter 6, you will notice that you have the Levites that are carrying the ark, but you have a group of fighters that are to lead the Levites in the ark, and then you also have a group that is kind of trailing and behind them. But all they're doing, day one, they're just marching. Now, there's 7 priests with 7 trumpets made of the ram's horns, and they are blowing the trumpets as they're going around the city. They go around one time, exactly as instructed by God. And it says that they continue to do this. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go to verse 10. It says, Now Joshua had commanded the people, saying, You shall not shout or make any noise with your voice, nor say a word, nor shall a word proceed out of your mouth until the day I say to you, Shout, then you shall shout. And Joshua was telling them here, for the first 6 days, we're going to march once as God has instructed. On that 7th day, God has instructed us to march around 7 times. But during that time, we're not to say anything until you're given the go-ahead. And they're instructed to shout. So on that 7th morning, it does go on to tell us how everything happens in that 6th day, or in those 6-day periods where they're to march around the city. I don't know. If you think about it, could you envision what the people of the city of Jericho were thinking? They're behind these double walls. They've got plenty of thing to keep them safe. I know that there's not necessarily cannon warfare or anything like that, but the author of the lesson, which I guess is Chad Ramsey, mentions that there's not any battering ram or anything to break through the wall, just a group of men. And in the middle of that group of men, there's a group carrying a box, basically. They're just kind of mounted up carrying a box, which is the Ark of the Covenant. But could you imagine what they were probably thinking? They were scared of the Israelites, so maybe they're probably not questioning them too much. But it's probably got to be an odd thing to just know that you march around one time, and it does mention that they are blowing the trumpets on those days that they're going around one time. And then they go back and they go to their camp. And then the next day, they do the same thing again. And this goes on for 6 days. So you can imagine maybe what the people in the city of Jericho were thinking. I mean, maybe they're still afraid, or maybe they're starting to question, well, like, how could they really break through? I don't see how this is going to do anything. But on that 7th morning, if you'll go to verse 15, it says, But it came to pass on the 7th day that they rose early about the dawning of the day and marched around the city 7 times in the same manner. On that day only they marched around the city 7 times. Now we're going into where Joshua is instructing them after they've marched. But he kind of gives them some messages here, so I want to read through this, starting with verse 16. And the 7th time it happened, when the priests blew the trumpets, that Joshua said to the people, Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. Verse 17. Now the city shall be doomed by the Lord to destruction, it and all who are in it. Only Rahab the harlot shall live, she and all who are with her in the house, because she had the messengers that we sent. Rahab obviously did a great thing. Jeremy did a great job of pointing out how she essentially was betraying the people of the city of Jericho. And I don't think she was doing it necessarily to spare her life. I think that she believed that the Lord that was leading the Israelites in and doing these great things, causing his people to take over the lands that he had promised, I think that she had belief that this was the true God. But it was a big thing that she did. You imagine that once they had come to her and asked, had they seen the spies? If they were to have known that she was lying to them, I have no doubt that she and probably all of her family might be led out and killed. I have no idea, but I don't think that would be completely out of the question. But Joshua does remind the men, only Rahab the harlot shall live, she and all who are with her in the house, because she hid the messengers that we sent. Now, if you read that, I'm going to read that one more time. Only Rahab the harlot shall live, all her and her. So what does the opposite of that mean? Everybody else is going to die, I think. And we're going to go on and read that in just a few verses. But that essentially tells me if only Rahab and the people of her house shall live, I think that means that everybody else, they're not to have their lives spared. And we're going to kind of go into that in just a little bit. But going on to verse 18. And you, by all means, abstain from the accursed things, lest you become accursed when you take of the accursed things, and make the camp of Israel a curse and trouble it. But all the silver and gold and vessels of bronze and iron are consecrated to the Lord, that they shall come into the treasury of the Lord. Have you ever heard of spoils of war? That's a phrase, I guess, that I'd heard a lot when I was young, but I didn't really understand what that meant. And I may not have the best definition of it now, but in battle or in any kind of war, depending on who's hosting the event, I guess if you could say, on whose ground that the battle is being fought, if the other side takes stronghold and defeats that in that battle and defeats the army, you can imagine the destruction. But there's also lots of things to gain from that. There could be possessions. If you're in a town and the town is basically decimated, there can be all kinds of possessions, gold, money, things of those. There could be weapons and things like that. But the spoils of war, basically, I think if I'm saying that correctly, that's when the defeating army can kind of take possession over all the goods that are there. It's kind of like, well, we have destroyed the city and we don't want this thing to go to waste. We can benefit from having these things, so we're going to take them. I think that's what the spoils of war basically, and that's not mentioned in the lesson itself. But I say that because here, Joshua tells them specifically, all the silver and gold and vessels of bronze and iron are consecrated to the Lord. They shall come into the treasury. Going back to verse 18, basically, if you take of those things, that it would curse Israel. So the men of Israel are to understand that they are to take this city. We're going to go through in a few verses, and we're going to kind of go over what that means for the people of the city. But as for the gold and the silver and the bronze and the iron and the things that you could profit from, they are not to keep those for profit. They are instructed to put them into the treasury of the Lord, because the Lord, and they're looking at this correctly. It's a good, if we step outside and look at that objectively, yes, the people of Israel are the ones battling and fighting, but they're only going to win because God's promised them the land. They're only going to be able to win this battle and go through the walls of Jericho because of God. So it only stands to reason that all these things that they could benefit or profit from, they're going to put them back into the treasury of the Lord. It's not going to go, if you want to think about it this way, if they find money on the ground, that's not to go into their pocket. They're putting it in a pot that they're going to sacrifice for what God's done for them. So I'm going to continue to read in verse 20. So the people shouted when the priest blew the trumpets, and it happened when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, and the people shouted with a great shout, that the wall fell down flat. Then the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they took the city. Verse 21, and they utterly destroyed all that was in the city, both man and woman, young and old, ox and sheep and donkey, with the edge of the sword. I didn't have enough prepared. I'd spent so much time on a lot of other things, but I think the author, if you'll read in the actual lesson, the author kind of brings point that if you're reading this, you could kind of look back and say that that's probably a little extreme, that everybody was to be decimated in the city of Jericho. But I think that the point behind that goes is that the people that lived in this land were wicked. They obviously didn't follow anything of the Word of God, so it's to be looked at that because of the evil and the wickedness of that city, God instructed them to take this city and to spare no one. Only Rahab and her family, which we're going to get into in verse 22.
Josh,
Yeah.
Also, you got to remember it's a purifying. He didn't want them.
Sure. Don't want to mix that in.
If they'd have done everything he said, the whole country would have been.
Sure.
Wiped them off.
I'm glad you brought that point up, Johnny. That honestly, that's the most important thing to take out of that. As a cleansing you don't want to, and it's kind of like if we were going back to what we studied previously in the book of Galatians. I mean, we mentioned how big of a deal that circumcision was and how God instructed them once they were crossed over the river Jordan, that the young men that had grown up in the wilderness had not been circumcised to this point, and God made that, you know, a point for Joshua to do that. But we're talking about in the book of Galatians and how Paul was fighting against the mixing of Gentile and Jewish traditions. I mean, the Gentiles were completely new to the Word of God for the biggest point of the Word. But the Jews of that time that had converted to Christians were trying to kind of intermingle those things and kind of keep the traditions of the Jews alive, and that was what Paul was fighting against. And Johnny brings a good point here. They don't want to mix in, they don't want to continue the sins of the people of Canaan or in the city of Jericho. They don't want God's people to kind of get in and intermingle with that. They want to kind of cleanse that and let everything start afresh of how God has commanded. Verse 23, and the young men who had spies, 22, but Joshua had said to the two men who had spied out the country, go into the harlot's house, and from there bring out the woman and all that she has, as you swore to her. 23 said, and the young men who had been spies went in and brought out Rahab, her father, her mother, her brothers, and all that she had. So they brought out all her relatives and left them outside the camp of Israel. I think it is going along with what Johnny had just brought up to the point of cleansing the city of Jericho and the things of the Israelites taking the land. Rahab and her family. Now, Rahab obviously had risked her life. She'd risked her life and done a great thing. But what do we learn about Rahab? I think that, we'll get to it in the very last verse here in just a second. But she dwells in Israel to this day. She mentioned of what she believed in the Israelites' God, into the God, our Lord, and how that He was probably the true and living God. He was able to help the Israelites do these great things. So she kind of had a belief at that point. I don't know this, but I think that would make a lot of sense into that. You know, the reason that they not only saved Rahab but her family, maybe that was, we're going to kind of learn a little bit here in just a second as we finish out. But I think it's kind of important to, you know, point out that I don't think that Rahab did this simply for the fact of sparing her life and her family's life. I think that she believed in God at that point, and that was partly the reason that her and her family could all be saved. 24 says, but they burned the city and all that was in it with fire, only the silver and gold and the vessels of bronze and iron they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. So they did obey what God had said. Verse 25 ends up and says, and Joshua spared Rahab the harlot, her father's household, and all that she had. So she dwells in Israel to this day because she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent out to spy Jericho. I'm going to flip over to Hebrews chapter 11 real quick, because verse 31. Can't get there quick enough after that bell. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 31 says, by faith the harlot Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe when she had received the spies with peace. This verse alone says, perish with those who did not believe. So that tells us that Rahab did believe. And again, I believe that was part of the reason she was spared. But also, too, if we go to Matthew chapter 1, I'm going to turn to Matthew chapter 1 real quick. I'm going to go to verse 4. If you remember the very first of the chapter of chapter 1 of Matthew, once we turn into the New Testament, the very beginning of Matthew chapter 1 is what? What do we know from Matthew chapter 1? A lot of names and a lot of reading. That's reading off the lineage that brought us to Jesus Christ, right? When we go to Matthew chapter 1 and we go to verse 4, Ram begot Amminadab, Amminadab begot Nahshon, and Nahshon begot Salmon. Salmon begot Boaz by Rahab. I think that it doesn't really specify in any other way, but I think that Rahab was in the lineage of Jesus. She's mentioned, I think, for that reason. We know that she begot Boaz, and Boaz married Ruth, and that, again, was involved in the lineage of Jesus. But these are awesome things. I didn't get to sum up the main point of the lesson, but I will say this. One thing I think we can take from this particular verse, or this particular chapter in the book of Joshua, is that Joshua and the Israelites did not question God. They were kind of given a task that may not seem to have made a lot of sense, but they carried through with it, and obviously they were given the city of Jericho. Thank you guys for your attention this morning.